Welcome to our literary journey. Hello, dear listeners. I am your narrator, and today I will share with you a truly touching story that took place in Brazil in 1881. A narrative about second chances, generosity, and how a simple gesture of opening a door can transform destinies forever. It was a stormy night when Francisco Silva, with 3 small children in his arms, was betrayed by his own wife and expelled from home with nothing. Walking for 2 days in the rain, he knocks on the door of a stranger. Maria Benedita had every reason to close that door, but something in her heart made her make a decision that would change not just one family, but entire generations. What would you do? Would you open your door to a stranger on a stormy night? Where are you watching from? Leave it in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave that like to help us grow. Year, 1881. Location, interior of Minas Gerais near São João del Rei. A time when a man's word was worth more than any contract and where hospitality was sacred. The October sun painted the coffee plantations of Santa Rita Farm golden, but Francisco Silva could not feel the beauty of that afternoon. His calloused hands trembled as he held the hoe handle, not from the weight of work, but from the weight of the truth he had just discovered. 9 years. 9 long years he had dedicated his life to that land that wasn't his, building a family in the small clay house that Colonel Sebastião de Oliveira had granted him. Rosa, his wife, embroidered on the porch while watching their 3 children play. Joaquim, 8 years old, strong like his father, Isabel, 6, sweet as honey, and little Pedro, only 10 months old, crawling on the packed earth floor. Francisco wiped the sweat from his forehead with the sleeve of his raw cotton shirt. The aroma of jasmine that Rosa had planted by the window mixed with the smell of damp earth after the dawn rain. Everything seemed perfect, as it always had. Until that morning, Donna Benedita, the washerwoman, had whispered words that Francisco had refused to believe. Rosa frequenting the big house when he was in the field. Rosa wearing silk dresses they could never afford. Rosa receiving jewelry from Colonel Sebastião. The sound of a carriage broke his thoughts. Francisco raised his eyes and saw the colonel descending toward his house. Sebastião de Oliveira was a 52-year-old man, widowed for 3 years, with a well-groomed greyish mustache and always impeccable clothes. He walked with the arrogance of one born to command. Francisco let the hoe fall and followed the red dirt trail. Each step was an eternity. The wind swayed the eucalyptus leaves, creating a symphony that seemed like a farewell. When he reached the house, he found the colonel sitting at the table where he ate every day, drinking coffee from the china cup that Rosa kept for special occasions. Rosa was beside him, wearing a navy blue dress that Francisco had never seen. "Francisco," said the colonel without lifting his eyes, "I need you to know that Rosa has made a decision. She's coming with me to the big house." The words echoed in the air like shotgun blasts. Francisco looked at Rosa, expecting her to deny it, to laugh, to say it was a cruel joke. But Rosa lowered her eyes and whispered, "It's better this way, Francisco, for all of us." The world collapsed. Francisco felt his legs weaken. He looked at the children, who played oblivious to the tragedy unfolding. "And the children?" he managed to ask, his voice hoarse as dry leaves. "They stay with you," Rosa replied, still without looking at him. "I can't take them." Francisco clenched his fists. Rage rose through his chest like fire, but transformed into something worse, a deep, cutting pain, like a sharp blade. The colonel stood up, adjusted his jacket, and declared with the coldness of one discussing business, "You have until dawn to leave the house, Francisco. This conversation ends here." Rosa quickly kissed the children's foreheads and left without looking back. Francisco was left alone with 3 children and the collapse of an entire world he had thought solid as stone. That night, he packed the few belongings in an old bundle: simple clothes, the wooden crucifix he had inherited from his mother, and a little flour and beans that Rosa had left. Joaquim, without fully understanding what was happening, only asked, "Daddy, when is Mummy coming back?" Francisco hugged his son and whispered, "We're going on a trip, boy." A very long trip. But where would they go? Francisco Silva, at 34 years old, had no living relatives, owned no land, had no money saved. He was just a betrayed man, with 3 mouths to feed and his pride in tatters. How does a man rebuild his life when everything collapses in a single afternoon? Francisco was about to find out. 2 days of walking, 2 days carrying Pedro in his arms, while Joaquim and Isabel took turns so their small legs wouldn't get too tired. Francisco's worn boots sank into the mud of dirt roads, and the sky loaded with dark clouds announced a storm. Little Pedro cried from hunger. Francisco had given the last corn biscuit to the children at noon, and now nothing remained but the hope of finding shelter before the rain soaked them completely. "Daddy, I'm scared," whispered Isabel, holding her father's hand tightly. Francisco lifted her in his arms, now carrying 2 children, one on each side. Joaquim, brave as always, walked alongside trying to be strong, but Francisco saw in the boy's face the fatigue and confusion. The first thunder echoed among the hills like a distant drum. Then came the clarity of lightning, followed by another closer rumble. The first drops began to fall thick and cold, splashing the red dust of the road. That's when Francisco saw the light. A small lamp flickered in the window of a simple house, about 100 meters from the main road. The construction was modest. Whitewashed walls, clay tile roof, a small wooden porch where 2 rough benches could be seen. The rain increased in intensity as if the sky had burst its gates. Francisco ran, carrying the children, his feet slipping in the mud, his heart beating hard not just from effort but from uncertainty. Would he be welcomed? Who would open the door to strangers on a night like that? He climbed the 3 wooden steps of the porch and knocked on the door. The sound echoed inside the house, mixed with the noise of the rain that now fell torrentially. Pedro cried louder, wet and hungry. Isabel trembled with cold in her father's arms. Footsteps approached. Francisco held his breath. The door opened slowly, revealing a young woman with brown hair pulled back in a simple bun. She wore a light blue calico dress and an apron tied at her waist. Her eyes, large and expressive, shone with surprise seeing the soaked family on her porch. "Good evening," said Francisco, trying to control his choked voice. "I apologize for bothering you at this hour. We are traveling with the children and the rain caught us. Could you perhaps—" "Come in, please," interrupted the woman, opening the door completely. "Quickly, before you get any wetter." Maria Benedita, that was her name, as he learned later, didn't hesitate for a second. She guided the family inside the simple but clean house, where a wood stove radiated cozy warmth. The aroma of fresh coffee mixed with the smell of burning wood and coconut soap. "Sit here by the fire," she said, indicating benches near the stove. "I'll get dry cloths and something hot to drink." Francisco sat carefully, still holding Pedro. Joaquim and Isabel snuggled beside him, finally safe after 2 days of uncertainty. The house was small, a room that also served as a kitchen, 2 doors that seemed to lead to bedrooms, and a dark wooden table where remains of a simple meal could be seen. Maria returned carrying clean cloths and a basin with warm water. "To clean the children," she explained with a gentle smile, "and the coffee is warming." It was then that an older lady emerged from one of the rooms. She must have been about 58 years old, completely white hair pulled back in a bun, and hands that seemed painful. Francisco would notice later that she suffered from arthritis. "This is my mother, Donna Catarina," Maria introduced. "Mama, I found this family on our porch fleeing from the storm." Donna Catarina studied Francisco with experienced eyes, but there was no judgment in her gaze, only understanding. "The house is small, but there's room for everyone," she declared simply. "No one should spend a night like this in the open." Maria served sweet hot coffee in clay mugs. She also brought cornbread and a piece of fresh cheese. The children ate eagerly, and Francisco felt for the first time in 2 days that maybe not everything was lost. "I come from far away," Francisco told them when Maria asked about his journey. "I worked on a farm, but things changed. Now I'm looking for a place to start over." Maria nodded without asking more questions. There was something in her eyes that suggested deep understanding, as if she too knew the bitter taste of unexpected changes. Outside, the storm raged with full force. Lightning illuminated the small windows of the house, and the wind made the roof boards groan. But inside, by the stove, Francisco felt for the first time in 2 days that he was safe. "You can sleep in the living room," Maria offered. "There are enough blankets, and in the morning we can talk better." While preparing an improvised bed for the family on the living room floor, Francisco observed Maria Benedita. She couldn't be more than 26 years old, but moved with the security of someone who had learned early to face difficulties. Her hands were delicate but marked by work, and there was a serenity in her gestures that calmed the heart. Pedro finally fell asleep in Isabel's lap, who in turn nestled against Joaquim. Francisco covered the children with the blankets that Maria had brought, clean and smelling of lavender, and felt a gratitude he didn't know how to express. "Why did you open the door?" he asked quietly, when Maria was preparing to go to sleep. "You don't even know me." Maria stopped and looked at him directly in the eyes. Because I've been on the outside of the door, she replied simply. And I know how it hurts when it doesn't open. That answer would echo in Francisco's mind for years. What sorrows did Maria carry? And how had such a young woman learned so much wisdom? The rooster crowed 3 times before dawn. Francisco opened his eyes and for a moment didn't know where he was. Then came the memory, the storm, the door that had opened, Maria Benedita's kindness. Beside him, the 3 children still slept deeply for the first time in many days. The aroma of coffee and sweet bread came from the kitchen. Francisco got up slowly, so as not to wake the children, and found Maria by the stove, stirring a pot from which scented steam arose. "Good morning," she greeted with a shy smile. "I hope you rested well." "Like never before, ma'am. Thank you very much for the hospitality." Maria served coffee in a mug and handed it to Francisco. "My name is Maria Benedita, but everyone knows me as Mariña. And you?" "Francisco Silva. But you can call me Chico." She nodded and went back to stirring the pot. Francisco observed through the small window what the night hadn't allowed him to see. The farm was modest. A main house, a small corral with 4 cows and a bull, a chicken coop from where the morning cackling came, and lands that extended as far as the eye could reach, perhaps about 3 acres. "Is this place yours?" Francisco asked. "Mine and Mama's. It belonged to my husband, Domingos. He died of yellow fever 2 years ago." Maria's voice carried a contained sadness, like rain that threatens to fall but holds back in the clouds. Francisco understood what kind of pain she knew, the pain of those who stay behind, who need to rebuild alone. "I'm very sorry," he said sincerely. "Thank you." Maria turned and faced him. "May I ask an indiscreet question, Mr. Chico?" Francisco nodded. "What really happened? A working man like you doesn't go on a journey like this just by choice." Francisco lowered his eyes to the coffee mug. How to explain the humiliation without diminishing himself further? How to tell that he had been betrayed by his own wife? "My wife, he began, and stopped. "I understand," Maria said gently. "You don't need to explain now." At that moment, Donna Caterina appeared, walking slowly because of the pain in her joints. She wore a simple black dress and a crocheted shawl on her shoulders. "Good morning, Mr. Francisco. How did you spend the night?" "Very well, Donna Caterina. I have no words to thank you." The lady sat in a wicker chair and observed Francisco attentively. "Mariña told me you're looking for work. What do you know how to do?" "A little of everything. I worked 9 years on a coffee farm. I know how to deal with planting, cattle, construction. I have strength and willingness." Donna Caterina and Maria exchanged a quick glance. "Mr. Francisco," Maria said after a moment, "I need to be direct with you. This farm is difficult to manage alone. Without a man to help, I can't handle everything. The corn and bean planting is behind, the corral needs repairs, and there's much work that my hands can't do." Francisco listened with growing attention. "What are you proposing?" "A partnership. You work the land with us. Take care of the cattle and repairs. In return, you have house food and a percentage of what we produce. It's not much, but it's honest." Francisco felt his heart accelerate. Could it be possible? A second chance, so quickly? "And my children? They'll be welcome," Maria replied without hesitation. This house was once full of laughter. It would be good to have children here again. Donna Caterina stood up and touched Francisco's shoulder. "Son, I recognize an honest man when I see one, and Mariña needs help. If you want to stay, it will be a blessing for all of us." At that moment, Joaquim appeared in the kitchen, rubbing his sleepy eyes. "Daddy, are we leaving already?" Francisco looked at his son, then at Maria, then at the window where he could see a piece of land that could be his new chance to rebuild lost dignity. "No, my son. I think we're going to stay a while." Maria smiled, and Francisco saw in her eyes something he didn't expect. Relief, as if she also needed that partnership as much as he did. "Then it's agreed," she said, extending her small but firm hand. "We're partners now, Mr. Francisco." When he shook that delicate hand, Francisco felt that he wasn't just sealing a work agreement. He was taking the first step on a journey that might lead him back to dignity and, who knows, to something even more precious. Sometimes destiny disguises itself as a storm to push us exactly where we need to be. Francisco didn't know it yet, but he had just found much more than work. 4 months passed like water flowing gently through a riverbed. Francisco woke before the rooster crowed and worked until the sun set, making up for lost time in the corn and bean plantation. His hands, already calloused from a lifetime of work, gained new wounds and new calluses, but also new hope. Maria's farm flourished under his care. The corral, once crooked and with rotten wood, now stood straight and strong. The fence that separated the pasture from the plantation was rebuilt plank by plank. The 4 cows, once thin, fattened grazing in the new fields that Francisco opened with hoe and sweat. But it wasn't just the land that flourished. The children had also found new life in that place. Joachim had become his father's inseparable helper, learning to milk the cows and care for the cattle with the seriousness of a grown man. Isabel, in turn, had stuck to Maria like ivy to a wall, following her through household chores and calling her Aunt Maria with growing affection. Little Pedro, who had turned one, was already crawling throughout the house, laughing with Donna Catarina's pampering, who, despite the pain in her hands, insisted on caring for the boy while Maria and Francisco worked. Francisco had begun to notice things about Maria that had previously escaped him: the way she hummed softly while preparing lunch, how her eyes shone when Isabel managed to help her make a cake without spilling the flour, the delicacy with which she cared for Pedro, bathing and dressing him as if he were her own son. One afternoon, while fixing the corral gate, Francisco hurt his leg on a wood splinter. The cut was deep, tearing his pants and making blood flow. Joachim ran to call Maria, who came hurrying with clean cloths and a basin of water. "Let me see," she said, kneeling beside Francisco, who had sat on a stone. Her hands, small but sure, cleaned the wound carefully. Francisco felt something strange run through his body. It wasn't pain, it was something else, something he hadn't felt for a long time. "I'll get some herbs to heal it faster," Maria said. "I learned from my grandmother. Thyme, rosemary, and a little aloe." While she prepared the home remedy, Francisco watched her work. Maria moved through the kitchen like someone who knows every corner, every utensil. There was harmony in her gestures, a silent music that calmed the soul. "Ready?" she said, returning with a light green paste. "It will sting a little, but it helps heal." When she applied the remedy, Francisco felt her hands tremble slightly, or perhaps they were his. Their eyes met for a moment, and there, in that gaze, Francisco saw something that scared and encouraged him at the same time. "Thank you," he whispered. "You're welcome," Maria replied, lowering her eyes. "It's the least I can do for someone who takes such good care of us." In the days that followed, while Francisco recovered from his injured leg, Maria insisted that he rest more. She brought him coffee on the porch in the morning, asked how he was feeling, cared for him with attention that went beyond simple courtesy. One night when May had already arrived, bringing the cool of morning, Francisco and Maria met on the porch after dinner. The children slept. Donna Catarina knitted in her room, and only the cricket song and the wind swaying the mango tree leaves could be heard. "Mr. Chico," Maria said, breaking the silence, "may I ask a question?" "Of course." "Do you still think about her?" Francisco knew who Maria was talking about. Rosa, the woman who had betrayed him and abandoned her own children for empty promises of luxury and status. "Less and less," he replied honestly. "The hurt is passing. And when I look at my children happy here, I realize that maybe everything happened as it should have." Maria nodded thoughtfully. "Do you know that I've been a widow for 2 years?" she said. "At first, I thought I would never again be able to, that I could never again." She left the sentence hanging, but Francisco understood. "And now?" "Now I think the heart is like good soil. If we take proper care of it, something new can always sprout." Francisco turned to look at her. In the yellowish light of the lamp burning in the window, Maria seemed more beautiful than ever. It wasn't a flashy beauty like Rosa's, but a serene, deep beauty, like someone with a beautiful soul. "Maria," he began, but stopped. "Say it. I feel something for you. Something I don't know if I have the right to feel." Maria lowered her head, but Francisco saw a small smile appear on her lips. "And why wouldn't you have the right? Because I arrived here destroyed. Because I have 3 children. Because I own nothing but the clothes on my back." Maria stood up and stood in front of him. "Mr. Francisco, you arrived here on a stormy night, but you didn't come empty-handed. You brought honest work. You brought affection for the children. You brought new life to this house. If that's not wealth, I don't know what is." Francisco also stood up, and for the first time in months, gently touched Maria's face. "So can I say that I'm falling in love with you?" "You can," she whispered, "because I am too." At that moment, under the light of May's stars and the jasmine perfume coming from the garden, Francisco kissed Maria Benedita. It was a sweet, respectful kiss, loaded with all the gratitude and affection that had grown between them over those months. When they separated, Francisco saw tears in Maria's eyes. "Are they tears of joy?" he asked worriedly. "They are tears of relief," she replied. "Relief to know that the heart can indeed learn to love again." And so two wounded hearts discovered that true love is not one that never gets hurt, but one that learns to heal and flourish again. The bell of San Benedito Church rang 12 times that August morning of 1882, announcing not only noon, but also the wedding of Francisco Silva and Maria Benedita Santos. Father Antonio, a 60-year-old man with a white beard and kind eyes, waited for the couple at the simple but decorated altar with field flowers that Isabel and other neighborhood girls had gathered at dawn. Francisco wore his best outfit, well-pressed black pants, white cotton shirt, and a jacket borrowed from Mr. Zeta Venda, who had insisted on contributing to the couple's happiness. His hair, normally rebellious after work, was carefully combed, and his hands, always marked by daily labor, had been scrubbed until they shone. Maria was radiant in a simple white dress that she had sewn herself during the nights of the previous month. The fabric, a fine cotton bought with savings from selling eggs and cheese, fell softly over her slender body. Her brown hair, normally pulled back in a practical bun, was loose over her shoulders, adorned with small orange blossom flowers that Donna Caterina had brought from the backyard. The children were in the front row. Joaquim, 9 years old, wore a new shirt and firmly held the hand of little Pedro, now 1 year and 4 months old, who swung his chubby legs and smiled at everyone. Isabel, wearing a yellow dress that Maria had made especially for her, couldn't stop whispering, "Aunt Maria is going to be our real mum now, right, Daddy?" The church was full. Neighbors from leagues around had come for the ceremony. Mr. Antonio Ferreira and his wife Donna Rosa, a name that Francisco now heard without feeling pain, the Machado brothers who had a farm nearby, the merchant's family from the village, and even some workers from distant farms who had known Francisco in past years. "Dearly beloved," began Father Antonio, then corrected himself, smiling. "Sorry, dear brothers, we are gathered here before God to unite in marriage Francisco Silva and Maria Benedita Santos." Francisco looked at Maria and felt his heart accelerate. 10 months earlier, he was lost on a muddy road with 3 hungry children. Now he stood before the altar marrying the woman who had returned not only his dignity, but also his faith in true love. "Francisco," said the priest, "do you accept Maria Benedita as your wife to love and protect her in health and sickness, in wealth and poverty, all the days of your life?" "I do," Francisco replied with a firm voice that echoed throughout the church. "Maria Benedita, do you accept Francisco as your husband to love and support him in health and sickness, in wealth and poverty, all the days of your life?" "I do," whispered Maria, with tears of happiness in her eyes. When the priest declared them husband and wife, the church exploded in applause and cheers. Francisco kissed Maria gently, and at that moment Isabel shouted excitedly, "Now Aunt Maria is my mother of the heart." After the ceremony, everyone headed to the yard in front of the church where the community women had prepared a simple but abundant feast. There was stewed chicken, rice with chicken, tropero beans, banana farofa, milk and guava sweets, and the famous cachaça from Mr. Joaquim Pereira, distilled in his own still. Francisco danced with Maria to the sound of a viola played by young Bento, son of Mr. Antonio. It was slow and sweet music, and as they spun gently on the packed earth yard, Francisco whispered in his wife's ear, "Thank you for giving me a family again. Thank you for giving me children to love," Maria replied. The party continued until late into the night, but Francisco and Maria left early with the children. The way back to the farm, which was now truly everyone's home, was made in a borrowed cart with Pedro sleeping in Maria's lap and Joaquim and Isabel excitedly telling about all the sweets they had eaten. When they arrived home, Donna Caterina, who had stayed to care for the animals, was waiting for them on the porch with a huge smile. "How was it?" she asked anxiously. "Perfect, Mama," Maria replied, hugging her mother. "Now we are a complete family." On that first night as husband and wife after putting the children to bed, Francisco and Maria sat on the porch as they did every night. But now there was something different in the air, the certainty that they belonged to each other, the security of the commitment made before God and men. "Do you know what's most beautiful?" said Maria, leaning against Francisco's shoulder. "What?" "Isabel called me Mother of the Heart. There's no more beautiful title than that." Francisco kissed his wife's perfumed hair and whispered, "Our family is going to grow even more, Maria. I'm sure of it." As if it were prophecy, 3 months later, Maria discovered she was expecting a baby. Actually, as they found out later, it was 2 babies. twins who would be born at the end of May 1883. Teresa and Antonia came into the world on a sunny morning, with midwife Donna Firmina declaring that she had never seen such healthy and beautiful twins. Francisco cried with emotion, holding his daughters for the first time, and Joaquim, Isabel, and Pedro surrounded the bed where Maria rested, amazed by their tiny little sisters. "Now we are 7, said Isabel, counting on her little fingers. "A very big family, and very happy," completed Francisco, looking around at his house full of life, love, and laughter. "Sometimes happiness doesn't come as we expect. Sometimes it knocks on our door on a stormy night, and we only recognize it when it's already living in our heart." 6 years passed like leaves dancing in the wind, quick but leaving deep marks. It was 1888, and the small farm that had welcomed Francisco on a stormy night had transformed into a prosperous farm known as São Benedito, a name chosen in honor of the saint who protected the needy. Francisco, now 40 years old, raised his eyes from the coffee plantation that extended as far as the eye could see. What had begun as 3 acres of corn and beans now encompassed lands he had bought from neighboring properties with coffee profits, a product he had discovered to be true green gold in that region of Minas Gerais. The March sun beat hard on the backs of workers, helping with the harvest. Francisco was no longer a man alone fighting against the world. Now he employed 5 families from the region, offering honest work and fair wages to those who needed it. "Daddy!" shouted a child's voice coming from the direction of the house. Francisco turned and saw Teresa running through the paths between the coffee plants. The 5-year-old girl, with curly hair like her mother's and clever eyes like her father's, came breathless from running so much. "Mama sent word that lunch is ready," she said, trying to catch her breath. "Where is your sister?" Francisco asked, cleaning his hands on the cloth he carried at his waist. "Antonia is helping Grandma Catarina make dulce de leche, and Isabel is at the shop with Mama." The shop. Francisco smiled, thinking of Maria's latest innovation. 2 years earlier, she had had the idea to open a small store on the road connecting São Juan del Rey to the interior farms. What began as a table with homemade cheeses and sweets had become a mandatory stop for muleteers and travelers. Maria had become famous in the region for her creamy dulce de leche, her cornbreads that melted in your mouth, and her aged cheeses that competed in quality with the best in the region. The shop not only brought extra money, it brought people, stories, news from the world beyond the farm's limits. Francisco walked toward the house, observing the changes that years of prosperity had brought. The old house with simple walls was now a solid brick construction, with 4 bedrooms, a spacious living room, a roomy kitchen, and a porch that embraced the entire front of the house. Maria had insisted on keeping the old wood stove in the new kitchen. She said the food tasted better. In the yard, chickens pecked freely among the fruit trees that Francisco had planted, mango trees, jabuticaba trees, guava trees, and a grapevine that was beginning to produce sweet grapes. The corral, once small and crooked, now housed 15 dairy cows and 2 bulls, providing fresh milk that Maria transformed into the region's famous cheeses. "Dad!" Joaquim appeared, coming from the corral, already 14 years old and nearly reaching Francisco's height. The boy had become a serious and hard-working young man, his father's true right hand in farm administration. "Mr. Antonio Ferreira stopped by here early today. He wants to talk about selling that piece of land on the border with the stream." Francisco nodded. Joaquim had a head for business, and Francisco had begun including him in important farm decisions. The boy who had arrived, frightened on a rainy night, was now a confident young man, respected by adult workers. Upon entering the house, Francisco was greeted by the familiar smell of home cooking. Maria was in the kitchen, her 34 years making her even more beautiful in her husband's eyes. She wore a simple navy blue dress and a flowered apron, her hair pulled back in a bun from which some rebellious strands escaped. "How was the morning?" she asked, serving him fresh water in a glass. "Very good. The harvest is better than last year. And at the shop?" Isabel sold 3 cheeses and 2 dozen breads to a troop that passed by. She's becoming quite the saleswoman. Isabel, now 12 years old, had inherited Maria's gift for dealing with people. The girl who used to hide behind her stepmother's skirts now received shop customers with sympathy and efficiency that impressed adults. Pedro, 7 years old, ran into the kitchen with his hands dirty from earth. "Mama, can I have lunch? I helped João plant the new coffee seedlings." "First wash those hands, my son," Maria said lovingly, indicating the basin with water and soap. Pedro obeyed happily. He was a healthy and clever child who kept no memory of the difficult times. For him, that had always been his home. Maria had always been his mother, and the prosperity surrounding them was the most natural thing in the world. Donna Caterina appeared from the pantry, carrying a tray of dulce de leche still warm. 64 years old and still manages to make the best sweet in the region, Francisco joked. 64, she corrected with a smile, and while these old hands can handle it, I'll keep making it. During lunch, seated around the large hardwood table that Francisco had ordered made the previous year, the family talked about plans for the farm. Teresa and Antonia, seated in high chairs to reach the table, listened attentively like little adults. I've been thinking about building a new house for the workers, Francisco said. Joan's family is growing and the little house where they live is getting small. Good idea, Maria agreed. And how about we have a June festival this year? Invite the whole neighborhood? Francisco smiled. Maria loved parties and gatherings. It was a way to give back to the community all the help they had received when they needed it most. Why not? The farm is prospering. We have reasons to celebrate. I can play guitar, offered Pedro excitedly. And we can dance quadrille, said Teresa and Antonia at the same time. At that moment, observing his family gathered around the abundant table, Francisco felt deep gratitude. 7 years earlier, he was lost on a road with 3 hungry children. Now, he had a family of 7 people, a prosperous farm, community respect, and most importantly, solid and true love. In the afternoon, while resting on the porch after lunch, Francisco saw Maria approaching with a mysterious smile. I have news for you, she said, sitting beside him. What kind of news? The kind that will make our family grow a little more. Francisco looked at her amazed, then his face lit up with joy. Are you? I am, Maria confirmed, laughing at her husband's happy expression. Another baby is coming. Francisco hugged her tenderly, feeling his heart couldn't fit in his chest from so much contentment. Material prosperity is good, but prosperity of the heart is even better. And Francisco had discovered that when we plant love and honest work, the harvest always exceeds our expectations. 12 years. 12 long years had passed since that October afternoon when Francisco's world collapsed with a simple betrayal. It was March 1893, and São Benedito Farm gleamed under the afternoon sun as living proof that second chances can generate miracles. Francisco, now 46 years old, watched with satisfaction the movement in his property's yard. Ox carts arrived loaded with coffee to be processed, workers moved organizedly between the sheds, and the sound of children's laughter came from the area where his younger daughters played. Joaquim, 20 years old, had become a true farm administrator, tall and strong like his father, but with the calm temperament of his adoptive mother, he commanded the coffee processing work with competence that impressed even buyers from the capital. Isabel, now an 18-year-old young woman, divided her time between helping Maria at the shop, which had become famous throughout the region, and studying letters with the teacher who came once a week to the farm to teach the family children and workers. Pedro, 15 years old, had revealed surprising talent for dealing with cattle and horses. He was the one who cared for animal reproduction and had managed to significantly improve the herd's quality through careful crossbreeding. The twins, Teresa and Antonia, 10 years old, were the house's joy. Intelligent and mischievous, they helped grandmother Caterina in the kitchen while learning to read and write with dedication that made their parents proud. And there was also little João, 5 years old, the biological son of Francisco and Maria, born 3 years after the wedding. A cheerful and affectionate child who completed the harmony of that family that had prospered beyond all dreams. Donna Caterina, now 70 years old, remained active despite growing pains in her joints. Her sweets and cheeses had gained fame that surpassed the county limits, bringing orders from distant farms and even from São João del Rei itself. Maria, at 39 years old, was more beautiful than ever. Motherhood and prosperity had given her face a luminous serenity, and her eyes shone with the satisfaction of someone who had built a solid life based on love and honest work. It was an ordinary March afternoon when Francisco saw a woman approaching on foot along the road, carrying a small bundle and walking slowly, like someone very tired. There was something familiar about that figure, but from so far away he couldn't identify her. When the woman came closer, Francisco felt his blood freeze in his veins. It was Rosa, his ex-wife, the woman who had betrayed him and abandoned their own children 12 years before. But what Rosa was this? The woman approaching was too thin, aged beyond her 41 years, with simple and worn clothes that contrasted violently with the silk and jewelry she had worn the last time Francisco had seen her. Rosa stopped at the farm gate and stood there, as if she didn't know whether she should enter or continue her journey. Francisco slowly got up from the porch and walked toward her, his heart beating fast, not from love or longing, but from a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Rosa," he said simply, stopping a few meters away. "Francisco," she replied, her voice hoarse and tired. You look well." It was more a statement than a question. Rosa looked around, seeing the large and solid house, the busy yard, the evident signs of prosperity. "What do you want here?" Francisco asked, without hostility, but also without warmth. "I need to talk to you, and to the children, if you'll allow me." At that moment, Maria appeared on the porch. She had sensed the tension in the air and come to investigate. When she saw the woman at the gate, she immediately understood who it was, although she had never seen her before. Some feminine intuition told her that this was Rosa, the first wife, the one who had abandoned the family. Maria came down from the porch and stood beside her husband, in a silent demonstration of support and unity. "This is Maria," Francisco said. "My wife." Rosa looked at Maria with a mixture of envy and sadness. She saw a serene, well-cared-for woman who radiated the security of someone who was loved and respected. "Nice to meet you," Maria said simply, without rancor, but also without affection. "I wanted to—" Rosa began, then stopped and restarted. "I came to ask forgiveness, to ask for a chance to see my children." Francisco felt the old anger wanting to rise, but it didn't come. In its place arose a strange compassion for that woman visibly defeated by life. "Where have you been all these years?" "With Sebastião, until he got tired of me and traded me for a French woman he met in the capital." Rosa's voice carried bitterness that hurt to hear. "I went to live in a boarding house in San Juan del Rey. I worked sewing to survive." Maria gently touched Francisco's arm. Maybe she could come in. "Have some coffee, talk better." Francisco looked at his wife, surprised by her generosity. "Are you sure?" "I am. She's the children's mother, and she seems to be needing Christian charity." Francisco nodded and indicated for Rosa to follow them to the house. When they entered the yard, activities diminished. The workers, perceiving that something important was happening, watched discreetly. On the porch, Rosa sat in a rocking chair and accepted the coffee that Maria offered her. Her hands trembled slightly while holding the cup. "Joaquim is at the processing plant," Francisco said. "Do you want me to call him?" Rosa nodded nervously. When Joaquim appeared, dirty from work and sweat, he stopped short upon seeing the woman on the porch. It took him a few seconds to recognize her. "Mother," he said, more from shock than affection. "My son," Rosa whispered, getting up from the chair. "How you've grown. You're a man." Joaquim didn't move to hug her. He stood still, arms at his sides, looking at that woman who was his biological mother but who had become a stranger. "Why did you come here?" he asked, his voice hard. "I came to ask forgiveness. I came to try to explain—" "Explain what?" Joaquim's voice rose a tone. "How does a mother explain abandoning 3 small children for luxury and status? How does she explain 12 years without a letter, without a visit, without even knowing if we were alive or dead?" Rosa began to cry. They weren't tears of manipulation, but of genuine repentance. "I made the biggest mistake of my life," she said between sobs. "I traded a real family for false promises. I lost everything, more than everything. I lost you." That's when Isabel appeared, coming from the shop. At 18 years old, she was a beautiful and determined young woman. When she saw Rosa, her face closed in an expression of total rejection. "So it's you," she said, her voice icy. "The woman who abandoned us." "Isabel, my daughter." "I am not your daughter," Isabel cut sharply. "My mother is Maria. She was the one who took care of me when I had fever. She was the one who taught me to be a woman. She was the one who was here every day for the last 12 years. You are just the woman who gave birth to me and then abandoned me." Isabel's words were like slaps. Rosa cried harder, but didn't try to defend herself. Pedro arrived from the corral and stopped confused seeing the scene. At 15 years old, he had very few memories of Rosa. For him, Maria was, and always had been, his mother. "Who is this lady?" he asked innocently. Francisco took a deep breath before answering. "She's your mother, your first mother." Pedro looked at Rosa with curiosity, more than recognition. For him, she was a stranger who made his family cry. Rosa spent only one night at the farm. Maria, moved by Christian charity, offered a room and a meal. but it was clear that there was no place for her in that family that had formed in her absence. The next morning, Rosa said goodbye. She quickly hugged Joaquim, who endured it without reciprocating. She tried to hug Isabel, who dodged. She kissed Pedro's forehead, who stood still without understanding, and she stopped in front of Francisco. "Thank you for letting me see them," she said. "And thank you for raising them so well." Francisco nodded. "Take care of yourself, Rosa, and may God bless you." When Rosa's figure disappeared around the road's curve, Francisco felt immense relief, not because she had left, but because he had finally closed that chapter of his life definitively. Rosa had returned, had asked for forgiveness, and had departed. The cycle was complete. "How do you feel?" Maria asked, hugging her husband. "At peace," Francisco replied honestly. "Finally at peace. The past can return at any moment, but it doesn't have the power to destroy the present we build with love and dedication." Rosa had returned and left, but the true family remained more united than ever. 20 years. 2 complete decades had passed since that October afternoon of 1881, when Francisco discovered the betrayal that would change his life forever. It was now October 1901, and the date didn't go unnoticed by the 54-year-old man who had become one of the most respected farmers in the region. Francisco was on the porch of the big house, observing the intense movement of his property, when he saw approaching along the main road an old cart pulled by a thin horse. The vehicle stopped at the gate, and from it descended a man that Francisco recognized immediately, although he could hardly believe the transformation he saw. It was Sebastião de Oliveira, the former colonel of Santa Rita Farm. But what man was this? Where once there had been arrogance and opulence, now Francisco saw only a 73-year-old gentleman, bent by the weight of years and defeats. His clothes, once always impeccable, were now simple and worn. His hair, completely white, was unkempt, and his hands trembled slightly, perhaps from age, perhaps from nervousness. Sebastião hesitated at the gate for long minutes before deciding to enter. He walked slowly through the yard, ignored by workers who didn't recognize him, until reaching the porch where Francisco awaited him. "Francisco Silva," said Sebastião, his voice weak but still carrying some dignity. May I speak with you?" Francisco studied the face of the man who had destroyed his first family. He searched within himself for the old rage, the desire for revenge, the bitter taste of humiliation, but he found only a serene tranquility, almost indifferent. "You can sit," Francisco said, indicating a chair. "Would you like some coffee?" The surprise on Sebastião's face was evident. He expected hostility, rejection, perhaps even violence. He didn't expect hospitality. "I accept," he replied, sitting with difficulty in the chair Francisco had offered. Maria appeared from the kitchen, attracted by the voices. When she saw the visitor, she immediately understood who he was. Francisco had told her the whole story years before, and she knew that this was the man who had seduced Rosa and destroyed her husband's first family. "This is Maria, my wife," Francisco introduced. "Madam," Sebastião greeted, rising slightly from the chair. Maria nodded politely, but kept her distance. She went to get coffee, but without the warm hurry with which she normally received visitors. "How did you know where to find me?" Francisco asked. "Your fame has spread. Francisco Silva, the man who built São Benedito Farm, the farmer who never refuses help to the needy." Sebastião smiled bitterly. "Irony of fate, don't you think?" Francisco didn't respond. He waited patiently for the former colonel to explain his visit. "I imagine you wonder why I came here," Sebastião continued. "The truth is I lost everything, Francisco. Everything. The farm was sold to pay debts. Rosa abandoned me when the money ran out, just as she abandoned you when I offered her comfort. I'm sick." He put his hand to his chest. "The heart can't take it anymore, and when a man is close to the end, he feels the need to settle his accounts." Maria returned with coffee and served Sebastião in a simple cup. He drank gratefully, his hands trembling slightly. "What kind of accounts?" Francisco asked. "I came to ask for your forgiveness," Sebastião said directly. "I know I don't deserve it. I know I caused terrible suffering to your family. I destroyed your life out of whim, out of stupid pride, out of—" He stopped, searching for words. "Out of pure evil." Francisco observed the man before him. He saw in him not the powerful colonel who had caused him so much harm, but only a sick and repentant old man, close to death and seeking peace for his soul. "And what do you expect to gain from my forgiveness?" "Peace," Sebastião replied simply. "The chance to die without carrying this weight on my conscience." At that moment the family began gathering on the porch. Joaquim, now a grown man of 27 years, married to a young woman from the village, and father of 2 small children. Isabel, 24 years old, also married and mother of a baby. Pedro, 22 years old, engaged to the neighboring farmer's daughter. The twins, Teresa and Antonia, 18 years old, and young João, 13 years old. They all positioned themselves behind or beside Francisco in a silent demonstration of family support and unity. Sebastião looked at that prosperous and united family, the same one he had helped destroy 20 years before, and lowered his eyes. "This is my family," Francisco said calmly. "You know some of them. These are my sons and daughters, my grandchildren, my wife. Thank God they grew up in love and dignity despite everything you did." Sebastião nodded, tears beginning to flow down his wrinkled face. "I also came to see them," he whispered, "to see that they became good people, despite the evil I caused them." Joaquim stepped forward. At 27 years old, he was Francisco's image in youth, tall, strong, with honest eyes and dignified posture. "Do you remember me?" he asked the former colonel. "I was 8 years old when you expelled us from the house where we were born." Sebastião raised his eyes and studied Joaquim's face. "I remember," he said with difficulty. "You were a small, frightened boy, frightened and abandoned," Joaquim completed. "But we found shelter, we found love, and we grew up in dignity." Isabel also approached, carrying her baby of a few months. "And this is my daughter," she told Sebastião. "Your great-granddaughter, daughter of the man you expelled from home on a cold night. She will grow up hearing the story of how her grandfather rebuilt his life with work and honesty." Sebastião looked at the baby and cried harder. Francisco stood up from the chair and stood before the man who had caused him so much suffering. The entire family watched him in silence, awaiting his decision. "Sebastião de Oliveira," Francisco said solemnly, "I forgive you." The words echoed in the afternoon silence. Sebastião raised his eyes incredulously. "How?" "I forgive you for the evil you did to my family. I forgive the humiliation, the suffering, the injustice. I forgive because holding resentment poisons the soul, and I learned to live in peace." Francisco extended his hand to Sebastião, who grasped it firmly, crying copiously. "More than that," Francisco continued, "I thank you." "Thank me?" Sebastião asked, amazed. "Yes, because if you hadn't destroyed my first life, I never would have found Maria. I never would have known true happiness. I never would have built this blessed family. Sometimes God uses even men's evil to lead us to greater good." Maria approached and touched her husband's shoulder, proud of his greatness of spirit. "You can stay for dinner," she offered Sebastião, "and if you want, you can spend the night here." Sebastião shook his head. "Thank you, but I can't accept so much. I've already received more than I deserved." He stood up from the chair with difficulty and headed toward the cart. Before getting in, he turned one last time. "Francisco Silva," he said, "you are a better man than I ever was. May God continue blessing your family." The cart slowly moved away down the dusty road. Francisco remained on the porch surrounded by his family, watching until the vehicle disappeared around the curve. "Father," Joaquim said, "why did you forgive him?" Francisco looked at his son and smiled. "Because forgiving is not a favor we do for those who wronged us. It's a favor we do for ourselves. Forgiving frees our heart to love even more." That night during the family dinner, Francisco felt a lightness in his chest that he hadn't experienced in 20 years. It was as if a heavy stone had been removed from his soul. Forgiveness had completed his inner healing. Forgiveness is the only revenge that also heals the one who practices it. Francisco had forgiven not out of weakness, but out of strength. And by freeing Sebastião from his guilt, he had freed himself to be completely happy. The new century brought with it airs of modernity and transformation for all of Brazil, but at São Benedito farm time seemed to flow with the same serenity as always. It was 1907, and Francisco Silva, at 60 years old, watched the sunset painting the coffee plantations golden as they extended to the horizon. His hair, now completely grey, swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. Wrinkles marked his face, not from bitterness but from smiles and legitimate concerns, the map of a well-lived life. His hands, calloused by decades of honest work, rested on the arm of the rocking chair that Maria had given him as a gift on his last birthday. Maria, at 53 years old, emerged from the kitchen drying her hands on a dish towel. Her brown hair now had silver threads that shone like stars, and her figure, though fuller than in youth, maintained the natural elegance that had always characterized her. She was a woman who had found her place in the world and felt completely fulfilled. "How is your heart today?" she asked, sitting beside her husband on the porch. Francisco smiled and put his hand to his chest. 2 years ago, the doctor from São João del Rei had diagnosed heart problems. Nothing that prevented him from living, but that required care and less physical effort. "It's fine, calm like its owner," Francisco joked. It was true. After handing over daily farm administration to Joaquim and Pedro, Francisco had discovered the sweetness of aging unhurriedly. He rose late, had prolonged coffee with Maria, devoted himself to grandchildren who visited him almost daily, and spent hours on the porch watching life continue its natural course. São Benedito Farm had prospered beyond all dreams. With 25 acres, it was one of the region's largest coffee producers. Maria's shop had transformed into a true commercial house, where not only sweets and cheeses were sold, but fabrics, tools, and products from the capital. Joaquim, married 5 years to Antonia Ferreira, daughter of the local merchant, administered the farm with competence that impressed even the great farmers of the region. He had 3 children: Francisco Neto, 4 years old, Maria Rita, 2, and baby Sebastião, born 3 months ago, a name chosen by Francisco as a final symbol of forgiveness and reconciliation. Isabel had married teacher Antonio Carlos, a cultured young man from the capital, and lived in the village where he taught letters to the region's children. She had 2 daughters, Rosa Helena, 2 years old, and little Benedita, 6 months old. Isabel visited the farm every week, always loaded with stories about her students and local educational progress. Pedro had chosen to stay at the farm helping his brother. He had married Helena, daughter of the neighboring farmer, a union that besides love brought economic benefits to both families. They had a 1-year-old son, João Pedro, and Helena was expecting their second baby. The twins, Teresa and Antonia, now 24 years old, had taken different paths. Teresa had married a merchant from the capital and lived in São João del Rei, from where she wrote letters telling about life in the big city. Antonia had remained single by her own choice, dedicating herself to caring for her aging parents and managing the shop with mastery inherited from her mother. João, Francisco, and Maria's youngest biological child had grown into a studious and dreamy young man. At 19 years old, he wanted to study law in the capital, a dream that Francisco was determined to fulfill despite the high costs it would represent. Donna Catarina, heroically, had reached 83 years old. Although her painful hands no longer allowed heavy work, she still supervised the kitchen and kept in her memory family recipes that she taught daughters-in-law and granddaughters. "Do you remember," Maria said, interrupting her husband's thoughts, "that tomorrow marks 25 years of our marriage?" Francisco smiled. How could he forget? 25 years of a union that had begun as a work partnership and had become the foundation of happiness, solid as rock. "Silver anniversary," he said. "Who would have thought when you opened the door for me that stormy night that we would reach this point?" "I knew," Maria affirmed with conviction. "Deep in my heart, I knew you were the man I would grow old with." Francisco brought his hand to his wife's face and caressed it tenderly. "And if you could go back, would you change anything?" "Nothing," Maria replied without hesitation. "Not even the difficult moments. They made us value the good moments even more." That night during the family dinner, Francisco looked around the table and counted 18 people: children, daughters, daughters-in-law, sons-in-law, grandchildren, a descendancy that grew like a strong and healthy tree. Each face carried something of him and Maria, not just in physical characteristics, but in values, character, and dignity. "Father," Joaquim said, raising the wine glass they had opened to celebrate, "I want to make a toast to 25 years of marriage, but mainly for teaching us that a family is built not just with blood, but with love and dedication. And for showing us," Isabel added, "that no matter how many times life knocks us down, we can always get up if we have faith and work." "To Grandpa Chico and Grandma Maria," the children shouted, raising their milk glasses. Francisco felt his eyes moisten. 60 years of life and the last 26 since that stormy night had been the best, not for being free of problems, but for being full of purpose and true love. "My children," he said, standing up from the chair, "you are my greatest wealth. Each of you carries within yourselves proof that God never abandons those who have faith and work with honesty." Maria also stood up and took her husband's hand. "And may our family continue growing in love and unity," she added, "so that our great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren still tell the story of how it all began on a stormy night, with a door that opened to the future." 25 years of marriage, 43 years of united family, 18 direct descendants. The numbers told only part of the story. The true wealth was in the invisible bonds that united those hearts in a chain of love that would extend through generations. The spring of 1908 arrived with its generous rains and promise of renewal, but Francisco Silva felt in his heart that this would be his last planting season. At 61 years old, his body was beginning to show clear signs of fatigue, especially the heart that had worked so hard to sustain a life of dedication and love. It was a September morning when Francisco woke feeling a different weight in his chest. Maria, always attentive, noticed her husband's pallor and insisted he remain in bed while she prepared an herbal tea she had learned from her grandmother. "It's nothing serious," Francisco said, trying to calm his wife. "It's just age arriving." But they knew it was more than that. Dr. Augusto, called from San Juan del Rey, confirmed that Francisco's heart was progressively failing. There was no treatment beyond rest and family comfort. "How long?" Maria asked the doctor, her voice choked. "Hard to say," Dr. Augusto replied honestly. "It could be weeks, could be months. It depends on how he accepts the situation and how much support he receives." Francisco accepted the news with the serenity of someone who had lived fully and completed his mission on earth. He gathered all his children on a sunny October afternoon, and sitting on the porch he loved so much, gave his final guidance. "Joaquim," he said to his eldest son, "you've already proven you're a competent and just administrator. The farm is in good hands. Continue treating workers well and remembering that prosperity without generosity is empty wealth." Joaquim, now a 29-year-old man, struggled to contain his tears. "Yes, father. I will honor everything you taught me." "Isabel," Francisco turned to his daughter, "you inherited from Maria the gift of caring and teaching. Continue being a bridge between our family and education, so our descendants always value knowledge. Pedro, my son, you have a generous heart and skillful hands. Help your brother, and never forget that land is only productive when cultivated with love. Teresa and Antonia, my girls, you carry within yourselves the strength of the women of this family. Always be united, and remember that a house without women's laughter is a house without soul. And you, João," Francisco looked at the 20-year-old youngest, "you have thirst for knowledge and big dreams. Fulfill them, but never forget your roots, and that true wisdom comes from the heart." After talking individually with each child, Francisco asked to be alone with Maria. The afternoon sun entered obliquely through the porch window, creating golden drawings on the wooden floor. "My love," he said, holding his wife's hands, "these 27 years by your side were the most precious gift God gave me. You saved me that stormy night and continued saving me every day since," Maria cried silently, caressing her husband's wrinkled but still handsome face. "Don't talk like that, Francisco. You're going to get better." "No, Maria, and that's okay. I lived more and better than I ever imagined possible. I have children, grandchildren, a beautiful family, a prosperous property, and above all, I had true love. What more can a man want?" Francisco pulled Maria closer. "I want you to live much longer. I want you to see our grandchildren grow up, to meet our great-grandchildren, and I want you to maintain this house's tradition. Never close the door to those who need help." "I promise," Maria whispered. "I promise that São Benedito Farm will continue being a place of shelter." Francisco smiled and kissed his wife's forehead. "Then I can depart in peace." Francisco's last days were serene. He didn't suffer intense pain. He simply gradually said goodbye to the world, like someone gently ending a conversation. He spent hours on the porch observing farm movement, receiving visits from neighbors who came to pay homage, playing with small grandchildren who filled the house with joy. One November afternoon, after a particularly peaceful day, Francisco called Maria and whispered, "I think the time has come, my love." Maria lay down beside him in bed, and Francisco closed his eyes with a smile on his lips. His last words were, "Thank you for opening the door." Francisco Silva died as he had lived the last 27 years, surrounded by love, at peace with himself and God, leaving a legacy of dignity that would extend through generations. The wake was an impressive demonstration of the respect Francisco had earned. People came from distant farms, from the village, from the capital, workers he had helped, families who received aid in difficult times, neighbors who knew his generosity. Father Antonio, now an 82-year-old elder, celebrated an emotional mass where he defined Francisco as a man who transforms storms into blessings and stumbles into opportunities. Maria would live 12 more years after her husband's death. 12 years during which she maintained all the traditions they had built together, The farm continued prosperous under Joaquim and Pedro's administration. The shop remained a meeting point for travelers. And the house never closed its doors to those needing shelter. In 1920, at 75 years old, Maria Benedita died peacefully on a Sunday afternoon, sitting on the porch where she had so often conversed with Francisco. Her last words were directed to Donna Caterina, who miraculously still lived at 95 years old. "Mama, I'm going to find Francisco. Take care of our family." Maria's funeral was even more crowded than Francisco's. Hundreds of people came to pay homage to the woman who opened the door on a stormy night and changed the destiny of so many lives. On her tombstone, the family engraved words that summarized her life philosophy. She opened the door on a stormy night and taught that a closed door lets no blessing enter. Death is just a door that opens to the other side of eternity. Francisco and Maria had planted seeds of love that would continue bearing fruit in all the lives they touched. 10 years had passed since Maria Benedita departed to find Francisco in the beyond. It was 1930, and São Benedito Farm had not only maintained its prosperity, but expanded its beneficial influence throughout the region. Under Joaquim's wise administration, now 47 years old, the property had become a reference in modern agricultural techniques and social responsibility. The big house remained with its original characteristics, but had gained a bronze plaque on the main door that simply read, "Open Door Farm, founded 1882. No one is a stranger here." It was a tribute to Francisco and Maria's memory, but also a promise religiously maintained by the entire family. Joaquim, married for 23 years to Antonia, had become a respected man not only for his administrative competence, but for his generosity inherited from his adoptive father. His children, Francisco Neto, 26 years old, Maria Rita, 24, and Sebastio, 22, helped in administration and had learned from childhood that privilege implies social responsibility. Isabel, at 56 years old, continued living in the village with her husband-teacher Antonio Carlos, but visited the farm weekly, bringing grandchildren to keep the family tradition alive. Her daughters, Rosa Helena and Benedita, now grown young women, had inherited their mother's love for education and assisted their father in the local school. Pedro, 47 years old, had remained single after Helena's premature death in a difficult childbirth. He had dedicated his life to caring for his son João Pedro, now 23 years old, and an excellent cattle administrator, and to keeping alive the memory of his adoptive parents through constant acts of charity. The twins, Teresa and Antonia, 45 years old, had taken different paths but maintained strong unity. Teresa had prospered as a merchant in the capital and contributed financially to various social works in the region. Antonia had never married, dedicating herself entirely to preserving family history and managing the famous shop, which was now a mandatory stop for all travelers in the region. João, the youngest, had realized his dream of studying law and had become a respected lawyer in São João del Rei. At 37 years old, married to a teacher from the capital and father of 3 children, he always returned to the farm on weekends to recharge his energies near his origins. Matriarch Donna Caterina had died in 1925, at 100 years complete, lucid and peaceful, surrounded by 4 generations of descendants. Her last years were spent telling stories to great-grandchildren about the heroic times of Francisco and Maria, ensuring that the family's oral tradition remained alive. One April afternoon in 1930, Joaquim was on the porch reviewing accounting books when he saw a family in difficulties approaching along the road. A young man, a woman carrying a baby, and 2 small children walking slowly under the strong sun. Their clothes were dusty, and it was evident they had been traveling for days. Joaquim immediately thought of his adoptive father. 49 years earlier, Francisco had arrived at that same property in similar conditions. He stood up from the chair and went down to receive the travelers. "Good afternoon," the man greeted, respectfully removing his hat. "I'm Carlos Silva. I come from far away with my family. We're looking for work, and they say this farm treats workers well." Joaquim smiled. "Silva, the same surname as his father. Coincidence or sign? My name is Joaquim. Welcome. And your family too." He looked at the woman who held the baby carefully, and at the 2 children hiding timidly behind their father. "You must be tired and hungry. How about coming in for coffee and a conversation?" Carlos Silva looked surprised. He didn't expect to be received in the main house, much less with such cordiality. "We don't want to bother, sir. We just need a work opportunity." "It's no bother at all," Joaquim assured. "This house has a tradition of receiving travelers, And there's always work for those with disposition. While guiding the family to the porch, Joaquim quickly told the farm's story. This property was founded by my father, Francisco Silva, who arrived here on a stormy night 49 years ago. He always said that a closed door lets no blessing enter. Since then, we maintain the tradition of never refusing shelter to those who need it. Carlos Silva stopped walking, moved. Francisco Silva, are you Francisco Silva's son? Adoptive son, Joaquim corrected. Why? My grandfather used to tell me stories about a man named Francisco Silva who helped our family in a difficult time around the 1890s. He said he was the most honest man he had ever known. Joaquim felt a shiver. Francisco's good deeds continued echoing through the years, creating waves of gratitude that reached the next generation. So you're the grandson of someone my father helped? I am. And today I come seeking help in the same place where my grandfather found it. That afternoon, Carlos Silva and his family were accommodated in one of the workers' houses, received work at the farm, and the beginning of a new life. It was as if history repeated itself, but with Joaquim assuming the role that Francisco had played decades before. During the family dinner that night, Joaquim told everyone about the episode. Pedro shook his head in admiration. It's as if Dad is still guiding our family even from beyond. It's not as if he were, Isabel corrected, who had come to dinner at the farm. He really is. Through each gesture of kindness we practice, through each door we open, through each hand we extend to help. Antonia, the eternal single woman who had become the guardian of family traditions, got up and went to get a thick book she kept in the living room. I've been registering all the families we've helped since Dad and Mum died, she said, leafing through the handwritten pages. It's 143 families in 10 years. Some stayed as workers, others continued their journey after resting and recovering. All took from here not just food and shelter, but hope. Francisco Neto, the eldest grandson, 26 years old, looked impressed at the record. 143 families. It must be almost 1,000 people who were helped. Not counting, added Joan the lawyer, the people they helped afterward, inspired by the example they received here. The good we do multiplies, like a stone thrown in water. That night, before sleeping, Joaquim went out to the porch and looked at the starry sky. He felt a comforting presence, as if Francisco and Maria were beside him, approving the continuity of their work. Father, Mother, he whispered to the stars, I hope I'm honoring everything you taught me. The door remains open. The tradition lives on. A gentle breeze swayed the leaves of the centennial mango tree that Francisco had planted, as if it were a kind response from beyond. The true legacy is not the properties we leave, but the lives we touch. Francisco and Maria had departed from the physical world, but continued transforming realities through the love they planted in each heart they welcomed. The 1940s brought winds of change and uncertainty to all of Brazil. World War II, though distant, affected the economy and created anxieties even in the most remote regions of Minas Gerais. The Open Door Farm, as it was now officially known, faced its first truly serious challenges since the heroic times of Francisco and Maria. Joaquim, at 57 years old, looked worriedly at the farm's accounts. Coffee prices had plummeted, the government had requisitioned part of the stocks for the war effort, and a prolonged drought threatened next year's harvest. Worse yet, the number of families seeking help had tripled, as the national economic crisis had forced many people to abandon their lands in search of opportunities. Joaquim, said Pedro, now 54 years old and right-hand man in administration, we need to talk about expenses. We can't continue helping so many people if our own situation is getting difficult. It was a hot December afternoon, and the two brothers met in the office that Francisco had used in his last years of life. The walls still displayed the same family photographs, and the solid wood desk held the same values of honesty and generosity. How many families are being supported now? Joaquim asked. Pedro consulted a notebook full of annotations. 17 families living on the farm as workers, plus 23 who received temporary help this month. That's more than 200 mouths to feed, besides our family. Joaquim ran his hand through his graying hair. It was a heavy responsibility, but one he had never considered abandoning. And our financial reserves could last 6 more months if we economize. A year if we drastically reduce the aid. At that moment, Antonia entered the office carrying a tray with coffee. At 58 years old, she remained single and entirely dedicated to preserving family tradition. Her hair was almost completely white, but her eyes maintained the iron determination inherited from her adoptive parents. "I heard the conversation," she said, serving coffee, "and I came to give my opinion." "Speak, sister," Joachim encouraged. "Dad and Mom faced difficult times and never closed the door. Remember when Dad broke his leg and we almost lost the first harvest? Or when fever hit the cattle? In all crises, they maintained faith and generosity." Pedro sighed. "But Antonia, times were different. Now it's a national, worldwide crisis. We can't solve all of Brazil's problems." "We don't need to solve Brazil's problems," Antonia replied calmly. "We just need to continue being faithful to our principles. One family at a time, as we always did." Isabel, who had arrived for the meeting, entered the office accompanied by João, the family lawyer. At 68 years old, Isabel maintained the lucidity and wisdom that characterized her, while João, at 47 years old, brought the perspective of someone who understood the country's legal and economic issues. "What's the situation?" Isabel asked, sitting in a chair near the desk. Joachim summarized the numbers and dilemmas they faced. Isabel listened in silence, then spoke with the authority of being the eldest daughter. "My brothers, I'm going to tell a story you might not know completely. In 1893, when our biological mother Rosa returned asking for forgiveness, Dad and Mom were going through financial difficulties. The farm was still establishing itself, we had many mouths to feed, and that was a year of low coffee prices." Everyone listened attentively. Even so, Mom offered food and shelter to Rosa, not out of excessive kindness, but out of principle. She told me later that she had promised God never to close the door to those who needed it, regardless of circumstances. And do you know what happened? "What?" Pedro asked. "The next month, news came that a large company from São Paulo wanted to buy our coffee for an excellent price. That sale saved the farm and was the beginning of our real prosperity." João nodded thoughtfully. "It's true. From a legal and financial point of view, temporarily closing our aid would be the most rational decision. But this family never made decisions based only on financial rationality." Francisco Neto, who had arrived during the conversation, respectfully interrupted. "May I suggest a solution?" Everyone turned to the 36-year-old young man, who represented the third generation of family values. "Speak, my son," Joachim said. "How about we talk with the families we're helping? Let's explain the situation honestly. Ask those who have already recovered to continue their journey, and focus on the most urgent cases. We don't need to close the door, we just need to organize it better." The suggestion made sense to everyone. Antonia smiled proudly. "It's exactly what Dad would do. Dad. Honesty, organization, and maintaining the essence of help." Pedro, always practical, asked, "And if we still can't balance the accounts?" That's when a female voice answered from the door, "Then I'll help." Everyone turned and saw Teresa, the twin who had prospered as a merchant in the capital. At 58 years old, dressed with urban elegance but maintaining Minas simplicity, she smiled at the gathered family. "I arrived a while ago and heard the conversation. My business in the capital is going well, and I always wanted to give back everything this farm gave me. I can contribute financially so we maintain the tradition." Joachim stood up and hugged his sister. "Teresa, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do," she cut him off. "This family taught me that prosperity is responsibility. If I have the means to help, it's my duty to do so." The meeting ended with a defined plan: reorganization of aid, Teresa's financial contribution, and absolute maintenance of family tradition. More importantly, it ended with confirmation that the values planted by Francisco and Maria had created roots so deep they would resist any storm. That night, during dinner, the entire family gathered to discuss the decisions made. The 4 generations present, from Joachim to the small great-grandchildren, heard once more the story of the door that opened on a stormy night. "Grandpa Francisco always said," Isabel told the children, "that difficulties are tests to verify if our values are true or just convenient." Little Carlos, a 6-year-old great-grandson, raised his hand as if he were in school. "Grandma Isabel, does that mean when we help others, even when it's difficult for us, we're passing the test?" Isabel smiled and caressed the boy's head. "Exactly that, my love. And our family always passed that test. Life's storms test not only our resistance, but our fidelity to our values." The Open Door Farm was proving that principles planted in love's fertile soil create roots capable of resisting any contrary wind. The year 1950 brought a discovery that would profoundly shake the emotional foundations of the Open Door Farm. It was a sunny March morning when an elegant man, approximately 50 years old, got out of a modern automobile at the property's gate. He wore an expensive suit, carried a leather briefcase, and had the air of someone coming from the capital with important matters to resolve. Joaquim, now 67 years old, received the visitor on the porch with habitual courtesy. The man introduced himself as Dr. Rodrigo Mendez, a lawyer from Belo Horizonte, and asked to speak privately with the Silva family. "Mr. Joaquim," said the lawyer after accepting the coffee that Antonia offered him, "I come here representing the estate of Sebastião de Oliveira, who died last year." Joaquim felt a shiver run down his spine. Sebastião de Oliveira, the former colonel who had destroyed Francisco's family 49 years before, and who had received forgiveness 25 years ago on that same porch. "What does his estate have to do with us?" Joaquim asked cautiously. Dr. Rodrigo opened his briefcase and removed several neatly organized documents. Sebastião de Oliveira left a very specific will. During the last 25 years of his life, he worked as a clerk in a small company in Belo Horizonte, living simply and saving every penny he could. Joaquim listened in silence, not understanding where this conversation would lead. In the will he makes clear that everything he managed to accumulate, a considerable amount I must say, should be delivered to the Silva family of São Benedito Farm as a form of reparation for damages caused in the past. The words echoed on the porch like thunder on a clear day. Joaquim was speechless for long moments. How much are we talking about?" Dr. Rodrigo consulted his papers. "Enough to pay off all the farm's debts, completely modernize the facilities and still leave significant capital for expansion. We're talking about an amount that would transform this property into one of the most modern in Minas Gerais." Joaquim brought his hand to his chest. At 67 years old, his heart was also beginning to show signs of wear, like his adoptive father's. The news was a shock that needed to be processed calmly. "Is there any condition? Any requirement?" "Just one," the lawyer replied. "The will specifies that the property must maintain its tradition of helping the needy." Sebastião de Oliveira wrote textually, "May the generosity of the Silva family be perpetuated with the resources I now give them as belated reparation for my past errors." Joaquim asked the lawyer to wait and went to call the entire family. In a few minutes the porch was full. Pedro, Antonia, Isabel, who had come from the village as soon as she received the message, João, urgently summoned from São João del Rei, and Teresa, who coincidentally was visiting the farm, Francisco Neto, Maria Rita, Sebastião, and all the other descendants of the third generation also gathered. It was an occasion that clearly required collective family decision. Dr. Rodrigo repeated the explanation for everyone. The silence that followed was deep and loaded with conflicting emotions. Isabel was the first to speak. "Does this mean that the man who destroyed our family dedicated 25 years of his life to trying to repair the damage?" "Exactly," the lawyer confirmed. "From the records we found, Sebastião de Oliveira lived extremely modestly, saving every possible penny. His neighbors said he constantly talked about a debt that needed to be paid and a family that gave him undeserved forgiveness." Pedro, always practical, asked, "And legally, are we obligated to accept?" "Not at all," Dr. Rodrigo clarified. "You can refuse the inheritance if you consider it inappropriate. In this case, the money would be destined to charity institutions in Belo Horizonte." Antonia stood up and walked to the porch window, observing the farm she had known since childhood. At 67 years old, she was the family's living memory, the guardian of traditions. "May I ask a question?" she said, turning to the lawyer. "Did Sebastião de Oliveira leave any letter, any personal message?" Dr. Rodrigo smiled and removed a sealed envelope from the briefcase. "He did, with instructions to be read only if the family decided to accept the inheritance." Francisco Neto, now a mature 46-year-old man, looked at his uncles and then at his own son, who represented the family's fourth generation. "Before we decide anything," he said, "I think we should ask ourselves, what would Grandpa Francisco do in this situation?" The question echoed in everyone's mind. Francisco Silva, the man who had publicly forgiven his enemy 25 years before, who had dedicated his life to transforming pain into generosity. Isabel closed her eyes and for a moment seemed to converse mentally with her adoptive father. When she opened them, she had a serene and decided expression. "Dad would say that accepting this reparation is not about money," she said slowly. "It's about allowing Sebastião de Oliveira to complete his journey of redemption. To refuse would be to deny him the chance to die at peace with himself." João the lawyer nodded thoughtfully. "Isabel is right. From a human and even spiritual point of view, accepting this inheritance is an act of compassion just as much as forgiving him 25 years ago was. Pedro, who had always been skeptical about sentimental matters, surprised everyone. And besides that, he said, imagine how many more families will be able to help with these resources. Sebastião de Oliveira caused one family's exodus, but now he's making it possible for us to help hundreds of others. Joaquim looked around the table, seeing the faces of 4 generations of his family. Everyone awaited his decision as patriarch. Dr. Rodrigo, he finally said, on behalf of the Silva family, we accept Sebastião de Oliveira's inheritance, and we would like to read the letter he left. The lawyer handed over the sealed envelope. Joaquim opened it carefully and read silently first, his eyes moistening as he progressed through the reading. Then, with a choked voice, he read aloud, "To the Honorable Silva family, 25 years have passed since Francisco Silva granted me forgiveness I didn't deserve. Since that day, I dedicated my life to trying to be worthy of that grace. I worked honestly, lived modestly, and saved every penny thinking of the day when I could give back even partially the evil I caused you. I don't expect this gesture to erase my past errors. I know I destroyed a family and caused immeasurable suffering, but I hope you can use these resources to multiply the goodness that always characterized your family. I die knowing that Francisco Silva was an infinitely better man than I ever was, and that his family continued being a blessing to all who crossed their path. May God bless you, and may the Open Door Farm continue being a beacon of hope for the needy. With respect and eternal gratitude, Sebastião de Oliveira." The silence that followed was deep and emotional. Even the small great-grandchildren seemed to understand the moment's solemnity. "Now I understand," Antonia whispered. "Dad didn't forgive Sebastião just out of generosity. He forgave because he knew everyone deserves a second chance to be better than they were." Joaquim carefully folded the letter and stored it with the family's most precious documents. "Dr. Rodrigo," he said, "please handle all the legal procedures. And when everything is resolved, I want us to build a small monument at the farm's entrance. It will read, Sebastião de Oliveira, a man who learned it's never too late to do good. True forgiveness not only frees the one who is forgiven, but also transforms their soul so profoundly that it can generate beneficial fruits for decades." Sebastião had completed his journey of redemption, and the Silva family had learned that mercy plants seeds that bear fruit at unexpected moments. The year 1960 would mark the end of one era and the beginning of another at the Open Door Farm. Joaquim Silva, family patriarch at 77 years old, observed from the porch the incessant movement of his transformed property. Thanks to Sebastião de Oliveira's inheritance, the farm had been completely modernized. New facilities, state-of-the-art agricultural equipment, comfortable houses for all workers, and a primary school that served not only the farm's children, but the entire surrounding region. More important than the physical improvements was the expansion of the social mission. In the last 10 years, the Open Door Farm had officially become a philanthropic institution recognized by the state, helping more than 1,000 families annually. There were dormitories for travelers, community dining hall, professional training workshops, and even a small hospital that provided free care to the entire rural population of the surroundings. Isabel, now 82 years old, remained lucid and active, serving as the official storyteller of family histories for new generations. Pedro, 77 years old, continued caring for cattle with his usual passion. Antonia, eternally single at 75 years old, had become the general administrator of all social works. Teresa, 75 years old, divided her time between the capital and the farm, continuing to contribute financially to assistance projects. João Francisco and Maria's youngest celebrated his 65 years as a respected lawyer and legal advisor to several charity institutions in Minas Gerais. The third generation had completely assumed administrative responsibilities. Francisco Neto, 56 years old, was the farm's general superintendent. Maria Rita, 54 years old, directed the school and educational programs. Sebastião, 52 years old, commanded agricultural activities. All married, with children representing the fourth generation of values planted by Francisco and Maria. And there was also the fifth generation, great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren who ran through the yard, played near the stream, where Francisco used to fish with Joaquim decades ago, and grew up hearing the same stories about the stormy night that changed an entire family lineage's destiny. It was a golden May afternoon when a special delegation arrived at the farm. The governor of Minas Gerais, accompanied by state authorities and journalists, came to officially recognize the Open Door Farm as state social heritage, an unprecedented honor highlighting its contribution to rural development and assistance to the needy. Joachim, wearing his best suit but maintaining the simplicity that had always characterized him, received the delegation on the porch where Francisco and Maria had so often sat to talk at day's end. "Mr. Joachim Silva," said the governor, an elegant man in his 50s. "It's an honor to officially recognize the extraordinary work your family has performed for almost 80 years. The Open Door Farm has become a model of social responsibility for all Brazil." Joachim thanked him humbly but made sure to correct, "Your Excellency, all credit belongs to my parents, Francisco Silva and Maria Benedita. They planted the seed. We just continued watering the tree they made grow." During the ceremony, which gathered more than 500 people in the farm's yard, Joachim was invited to speak about the property's history. Standing on the small platform set up for the occasion, he looked at the crowd that included authorities, workers, people assisted by the farm over the years, and 5 generations of his own family. "My friends," he began, his voice still strong despite his 77 years, "this story began on a stormy night in 1882 when my father, Francisco Silva, knocked on this house's door carrying 3 small children and a heart broken by betrayal." Joachim then told the complete story: the desperate arrival, Maria Benedita's generosity, the birth of a family based on love and not just blood, prosperity built with honest work, forgiveness given to enemies, and the transformation of sorrows into blessings. "My father always said," he continued, "that a closed door lets no blessing enter. He learned this from my mother Maria, who opened her door on a stormy night without knowing who was knocking. Since then, this family made a sacred promise: never close the door to those who need help." The audience listened in religious silence, many with tears in their eyes. "Today, 80 years later, I want to renew this promise publicly. As long as there is a Silva on this earth, as long as this farm exists, our door will remain open. No matter if times get difficult, if crises come, if the world changes, our essence will remain the same: to welcome, help, love." When Joachim finished speaking, the ovation was long and emotional. But the most touching moment came when Isabel stood up from her chair and asked to speak. Supporting herself on a cane but with her voice still firm, Francisco's eldest daughter walked to the microphone. "I was 6 years old when we arrived here that rainy night," she said. "I remember perfectly Maria Benedita's face when she opened the door. There was no hesitation, no fear. There was only instant love for 3 children she didn't know." Isabel paused, emotional. "Maria Benedita raised me as if I were her own flesh and blood. Francisco Silva gave me the example of honesty and forgiveness, but more than that, they taught me that family is not just who is born with us, but who chooses to stay with us. That true love is the one that gives itself without expecting return." Isabel's voice choked. "Today, at 82 years old, I can say I was one of the most blessed people in this world, because I had the chance to grow up in a family that transformed a tragedy into a love story. And I hope my grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren continue telling this story for many, many generations." When the ceremony ended and visitors departed, the family gathered on the porch for a simple dinner. 5 generations seated at the table, from Joachim to the small great-great-grandchildren, celebrating not only official recognition, but the continuity of values that seemed indestructible. Francisco Neto raised his glass for a toast. "To Grandpa Francisco and Grandma Maria, wherever they are, they must be proud to see that the seed they planted became a tree capable of providing shade and fruit for hundreds of families." "To the door that opened on a stormy night," added Maria Rita, "and never closed again. And to future generations," completed young Carlos, a 19-year-old great-grandson, "who will keep this tradition alive for 100 more years." That night, Joachim remained alone on the porch after everyone went to sleep. At 77 years old, he felt his mission as guardian of family tradition was being completed. The next generations were prepared, the institution was solidly established, and fundamental values had created roots so deep they would resist any storm. He looked at the starry sky and whispered, "Father, Mother, mission accomplished." The door remains open and always will. A gentle breeze swayed the leaves of the centennial mango tree, as if Francisco and Maria were whispering their approval through the wind. At the farm gate, the illuminated sign glowed softly in the darkness. "Open Door Farm, founded 1882, no one is a stranger here." And just below, a new phrase had been added: in memory of Francisco Silva and Maria Benedita Santos Silva, who taught the world that true love multiplies when shared. The story had completed its circle, from a stormy night to a nationally recognized institution, from 3 abandoned children to 5 generations of a united family, from a destroyed man to a lineage of people dedicated to rebuilding others' lives. And the promise remained intact. As long as a descendant of Francisco and Maria existed, there would always be an open door for those needing shelter, food, comfort, or simply the certainty that they were not alone in the world.